Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's, well, it's kind of behind the scenes, but it powers pretty much every app you
Oh,
use.
yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's how different software programs actually talk to each other.
Exactly. We're diving into the world of APIs, application programming interfaces. Ever wonder how your weather app on your phone gets the latest forecast?
Or how your social media feed updates with new posts. APIs are like the messengers, the go-betweens that make it all possible.
Right. It's like the unseen plumbing that connects apps to servers somewhere out there in the cloud. And, there are different ways to build these APIs.
Yeah, it's not just one size fits all.
Not at all. And the two big players we're going to unpack today are REST and GraphQL. REST has been the champ for a while, but GraphQL is this newer, more flexible kid on the block.
And they both have their fans, for sure.
Absolutely. We've got a ton of articles and research here that dive into how they work, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and even how they're used in WordPress.
Oh, that WordPress angle will be interesting for sure.
Yeah, a lot of folks are using WordPress. So our mission today is to really get to the core of what makes them different, when to use which one, especially if you're into web development or building stuff online. Now, I know this might seem technical, but we're going to break it down into bite-sized pieces.
We're all about making this stuff understandable. No jargon overload, I promise.
So let's kick things off with the veteran of the API world, REST. When someone throws around the term REST API, what are they really talking about?
Okay, so REST stands for Representational State Transfer. But think of it as a set of rules, almost like a style guide for creating APIs. And they leverage standard web protocols, mainly HTTP, the same thing that powers your web browser.
So we're talking about the same language that websites use.
Precisely. And the core idea is that you're interacting with specific pieces of data called resources using these standard HTTP methods. It's a bit like, imagine ordering food online.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So you've got the menu, right, that lists all the different dishes, which would be your resources in this case. And then you've got your actions like view details, add to cart, place order. Those are like your HTTP methods.
So those are the verbs that tell the server what you want to do.
Right on. And in the world of REST, you've got your get, your post, your put-t, and your delete. These are the workhorses of interacting with data.
So get is for grabbing information, PUST is for creating new stuff, PT is for updating, and delete is, well, for deleting.
You got it. And it's all happening on these resources we mentioned. So what exactly is a resource in this digital world?
From what I understand, a resource is basically a chunk of information with its own unique address on the web. We call that an endpoint, right?
You got it. It's like each dish on the menu having its own special code.
So if our app is about books, you might have an endpoint like books to see all the books and books 123 to see details about the book with the ID 123.
That's the gist of it. Each endpoint is like a doorway to a specific piece of data. And REST has some key characteristics that have made it so popular.
Like what are the things that really define a REST API?
Well, first, it's stateless. Think of it like each interaction with the server is a fresh start. The server doesn't remember your past requests.
So every time you ask for something, you got to give it all the details again.
Right. It's like a waiter who forgets your order every time you call him back. No memory of what you had before. Second, as we've said, it's resource-oriented. Everything revolves around those endpoints, those addresses for the data. And then there's caching.
Oh, caching, that's all about speeding things up, right?
Exactly. It's like your browser remembering a web page you visited recently. So you don't have to download it all over again. Saves time and bandwidth. And finally, REST plays nicely with the standards, like HTTP, which makes it easier for different systems to talk to each other.
Okay, so it's all about well-defined endpoints, standard methods for interacting with data, keeping things stateless, and using those familiar web technologies.
You got it. That's REST in a nutshell.
Now let's switch gears and talk about GraphQL. How does it shake things up in the API world?
GraphQL takes a totally different approach. It's not so much about architectural style, but more like a query language. Think of it as a more precise way of asking for data.
So instead of just hitting these predetermined endpoints, you're crafting specific requests.
Right. With GraphQL, the client, the app making the request, gets to say exactly what data it needs and how it wants it organized.
Okay, that sounds pretty powerful. How does that work in practice?
Instead of multiple endpoints, GraphQL usually uses just one, a single point of entry. You send your query to that endpoint, and the server figures out what you need and gives you back just that. No more, no less.
So it's like ordering a custom meal at a restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. You tell the chef exactly which ingredients you want, how you want them cooked, everything.
No more picking from a fixed menu. That sounds much more efficient. So what are the key features that make GraphQL stand out?
Well, first and foremost, it's those flexible queries we talked about. You can ask for exactly what you need, avoiding overfetching and underfetching.
Overfetching and underfetching. Let's break those down.
Overfetching is when you get back more data than you actually need. Like, imagine you just need a user's name and email, but the API gives you their entire profile, their address, their birthday, everything.
Ah, so it's like ordering a whole pizza when you just wanted a slice.
Exactly. And underfetching is the opposite. It's when you have to make multiple requests to get all the bits of data you need because one request doesn't give you everything.
So you got to keep going back to the counter for more slices.
Right. With GraphQL, you can often get everything you need in one well-structured query.
That's efficiency right there. What else is there?
GraphQL also uses a single endpoint, one URL for all your requests, and it's got this thing called a schema.
A schema, what's that all about?
A schema is basically a blueprint that defines all the data types and relationships in your API. It's like a map that tells everyone what's available and how it all connects.
So everyone's on the same page, no surprises.
Precisely. And lastly, GraphQL has built-in support for real-time data. Think of it like live updates, streaming data. They use something called subscriptions for that.
Subscriptions, like subscribing to a channel on YouTube.
Yeah, kinda. It's like telling the server, hey, if this data changes, let me know right away. No need to keep asking anything new, anything new.
Okay, that's a pretty big difference from the whole request response thing with REST.
It is. It opens up a whole world of possibilities for applications that need real-time information.
So we've got REST with its multiple endpoints and fixed data structures, and GraphQL with its single endpoint, flexible queries, and real-time capabilities. How do they actually compare head to head?
All right, let's break it down. When it comes to data fetching, REST uses those multiple endpoints, each with a predefined set of data. GraphQL uses that single endpoint with customizable queries.
And that leads to the overfetching issue we talked about.
Right. REST, with its fixed data structures, often sends you more than you need. GraphQL lets you be super specific and get just what's required.
And then there's the underfetching problem where you have to make multiple trips to get all the related pieces.
Yeah, GraphQL tries to solve that by letting you fetch interconnected data in one go. And then there's caching.
Oh yeah, caching is important for performance.
REST can take advantage of standard HTTP caching. GraphQL, because its queries can be so unique, needs custom caching solutions.
So it's a trade-off, more flexibility with GraphQL, but more work to make caching work well.
Exactly. Now let's talk about error handling. How do they tell you when something goes wrong?
Okay, errors. Nobody likes those.
REST typically uses HTTP status codes,
Huh.
like 200 for OK or 404 for not found. GraphQL usually just sends a 200 OK, but the actual error messages are buried within the response data.
So you always get a thumbs up initially, but you got to dig deeper to see if there are any hiccups.
Right. Now let's talk about the learning curve. Which one is easier to get started with?
That's a good question.
REST is generally considered easier, especially if you're comfortable with basic web concepts.
Okay, that makes sense.
GraphQL has a steeper learning curve because of its query language and the schema stuff.
Makes sense. It's more powerful, so there's more to learn.
Right. And lastly, there's the real-time updates thing.
Oh yeah, GraphQL has those subscriptions built in.
Yep. REST needs additional tools like WebSockets for that.
So if real-time is critical, GraphQL has an edge there.
Definitely.
Okay. That's a great overview of how they stack up against each other. Now let's dive into their advantages and disadvantages. What makes REST so appealing?
Well, its simplicity is a big plus. It's pretty straightforward to understand and use, especially for basic applications.
Yeah, ease of use is always a good thing.
And it benefits from those built-in HTTP caching mechanisms we talked about. Plus, REST is widely adopted. There are tons of tools and resources available for it. And that stateless nature we mentioned makes it easier to scale, to handle more traffic as your app grows.
Okay, so REST is like the reliable workhorse of the API world. But what are the downsides? What are the things that make people look towards GraphQL?
Well, the main drawbacks are those data fetching inefficiencies. The overfetching and underfetching we talked about can lead to performance issues, especially with complex applications.
Yeah, too much data flying around can bog things down.
Exactly. And then there's the versioning challenge. As your API evolves, you often have to maintain multiple versions to keep things working with older apps.
So REST can get a bit messy as your API grows and changes.
It can.
Okay, so what are the strengths of GraphQL that make it so enticing?
Well, the biggest win is its efficiency in getting data. Clients can be super specific about what they need, minimizing data transfer and speeding things up.
That's huge, especially for mobile apps and slow connections.
Definitely. The single endpoint also simplifies things a lot, and the strong typing with the schema helps catch errors early on. And of course, those real-time capabilities with subscriptions are a game changer for certain types of apps.
Sounds like GraphQL is a powerful tool when you need that level of control and efficiency.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's not without its own challenges.
Okay, so what are the trade-offs? What are the things to watch out for with GraphQL?
Well, it definitely adds complexity. There's a learning curve involved, and the lack of built-in HTTP caching can be a hurdle. For really complex queries, you might need to be careful about performance on the server side. And for small, simple projects, it might be overkill.
So it's not always the best tool for the job.
Exactly. You got to pick the right tool for the right task.
So generally speaking, when would you lean towards using REST, and when would GraphQL be the better choice?
REST is usually a good fit for simpler applications with straightforward data needs, especially if you need that easy caching or you're working with systems that already use REST.
Makes sense.
GraphQL shines when you have complex data relationships, need a flexible front end, require real-time updates, or when efficiency is paramount.
Okay, so far so good. Now let's switch gears and talk about WordPress. WordPress actually has its own built-in REST API, doesn't it?
It does. It was introduced a while back, and it lets developers interact with pretty much all the WordPress data. Posts, pages, users, media, you name it.
So you can use it to build custom themes and plugins that pull in WordPress data.
Exactly. You can create unique experiences without having to mess with WordPress's core code.
Cool. Now, what about GraphQL? Is that something WordPress offers out of the box?
Not natively, no, but there are plugins that add that functionality, with WP GraphQL being a very popular one.
So WP GraphQL essentially creates a GraphQL interface for your WordPress data.
Right. It makes all that WordPress data accessible through a GraphQL schema.
That's pretty handy for developers who prefer to work with GraphQL.
It is, especially for those scenarios where GraphQL's strengths really shine, even within the WordPress world.
Okay, so let's walk through some specific WordPress use cases. First up, a simple blog or website.
For that, the built-in REST API is usually more than enough. It's already there, it's easy to use, and caching works well. GraphQL might just be overkill.
Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. Now, what about a headless WordPress setup? Where WordPress is just the back end, and you're building a custom front end with something like React or Vue.js.
In that case, GraphQL would be a better choice.
Yeah, because your front end can be very specific about what data it needs from WordPress.
So, less data transfer, faster loading times.
Right. One of our sources even had an example: GraphQL query, GraphQL.query posts, title.content.author, load.node. That one query can grab the post title, content author name, and featured image URL all in one go.
Efficient and clean. Nice. What about an e-commerce website, like one built with WooCommerce?
E-commerce sites have lots of complex data relationships, products, categories, reviews, and so on. GraphQL can really simplify fetching all that related data.
So you can avoid making a ton of separate REST API calls?
Exactly. Our source gave an example query for that too. GraphQL.query, products, nodes name docs, product categories, nodes reviews, REWs, rating or review rating. That fetches the product name, price, categories, and reviews all in one go.
Much cleaner than multiple REST calls. Now, what about a real-time dashboard? Something that shows live data from WordPress.
That's where GraphQL's subscriptions really shine. You can get instant updates whenever something changes, like new user registrations or orders coming in.
REST would require extra work to achieve that.
Yeah, you'd need something like WebSockets, which adds complexity. Our source had an example subscription for user activity, GraphQL.subscription on user activity, user a day, action timestamp. That'll give you instant updates whenever a user does something on your WordPress site.
Really cool. Very cool. What about a mobile app that connects to WordPress?
Mobile apps often have limited bandwidth, so GraphQL's ability to fetch only the necessary data is a huge win there.
Makes sense.
You can craft a query to get just the post titles and excerpts for a blog post listing, for example.
Here's what that query looks like. GraphQL.queryFocus stachment that excerpt.
Nice and concise. No wasted data. Now, what about integrating with a legacy system that already uses REST?
In that case, sticking with REST might be the better approach.
Yeah, it'll likely be easier to integrate with something that already speaks REST. No
Yeah.
need to introduce GraphQL and potentially have to make changes to the legacy system.
Keep it simple, right?
Exactly. One of our sources even had a table summarizing when to use which approach in WordPress.
It basically said REST for simple sites and integrations, and GraphQL for those more demanding scenarios, complex front ends, e-commerce, real-time updates, and when data efficiency is crucial.
That's a good rule of thumb.
So it really boils down to choosing the right tool for the job, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each approach.
Exactly. And sometimes you might even use both REST and GraphQL together in a hybrid approach.
Yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all solution in the world of APIs. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into REST and GraphQL. Who knew how much complexity is involved in how software communicates?
It's a whole world behind the scenes that most people don't even think about.
But it's so fundamental to how our apps and websites work.
It really is.
So looking ahead, how do you see the landscape of REST and GraphQL evolving? With the rise of mobile, the Internet of Things, all these interconnected devices, how do you think these approaches will adapt? It's something to ponder as you consider your own projects and what you're building. Which approach do you think is more relevant to the challenges you're facing? That's something for you, our listeners, to explore. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.